There's a camera sitting in someone's online shopping cart right now that they shouldn't buy. Not because it's broken, not because it doesn't work, but because it represents one of the biggest betrayals in modern camera history. And here's the twist. You probably think it's a solid choice. By the end of this video, everything you thought you knew about safe camera purchases is going to be challenged. Number one on this list, it's going to hurt. It's going to confuse you. And when you hear the reasoning, you won't be able to look at that brand the same way again. So if you think you can guess which camera takes the crown for the worst release ever, stick around, because I guarantee you're wrong. Welcome to Alt Buzz. These are the only 10 worst cameras ever released, and this isn't clickbait. These cameras deserve to be called out because of how badly they were positioned, how overpriced they were, how outdated they felt, or how they betrayed the photographers who trusted them. Sometimes even decent cameras can be terrible purchases depending on market context. Let's dive in. At number 10, Canon M200. Let's start with a camera that didn't just fail. It felt like Canon wasn't even trying. The Canon M200 was released in 2019, and the moment it hit the market, it felt like a relic from 2015. This was Canon's attempt to appeal to entry-level vloggers and content creators, a demographic that was exploding at the time, hungry for affordable, capable cameras that could grow with them. Instead, Canon gave them a camera that felt like it was designed by people who had never actually met a content creator. Here's the thing about the M200. It had a flip-up screen, which sounds great for selfie-style vlogging, except the screen could only flip up, not out to the side. That means if you had a microphone in the hot shoe, which every serious vlogger would, you couldn't see yourself. It was a design flaw so obvious that people genuinely questioned whether Canon tested this camera with actual users. The autofocus was decent, sure, pulled from Canon's dual pixel system, but it lacked a microphone input. Read that again. A camera marketed to vloggers with no microphone input. You were stuck with the mediocre built-in mic or forced into workarounds that defeated the entire purpose of having a compact setup. And then there's the lens ecosystem. The EFM mount was already on life support when the M200 came out. Canon was clearly pivoting to RF mount, their mirrorless future, but they kept releasing EFM cameras like they were doing users a favor. Buying into the M200 meant buying into a dead system. Every lens you invested in would be obsolete the moment you wanted to upgrade to Canon's real mirrorless line. It was a trap disguised as an entry point. The M200 wasn't just a bad camera, it was a bad faith offering to beginners who trusted the Canon name. And the worst part? People still bought it because that red ring on the camera made them feel safe. At number 9, Pentax K-3 Mark III. Pentax is a brand that survived on pure nostalgia and a cult-like fan base that refused to let it die. And honestly, there's something beautiful about that loyalty. But the K-3 Mark III, released in 2021, tested that loyalty to its absolute limit. This camera was supposed to be Pentax's triumphant return, a flagship APS-C DSLR that would remind the world why Pentax mattered. Instead, it reminded everyone why Pentax was struggling. Let's talk about what this camera was competing against. In 2021, Sony had the A6600, Fujifilm was dominating with the X-T4, Canon and Nikon were pushing their mirrorless systems hard, and even budget options were packing incredible autofocus and video capabilities. The K-3 Mark III entered this battlefield with contrast detect autofocus, not hybrid, not phase detect, contrast detect. The same technology that made cameras frustrating to use a decade ago. For a camera priced at nearly $2,000, that was insulting. And it wasn't just the autofocus. The video specs were laughable for 2021. You got 4K at 30 frames per second with a massive crop, no 10-bit recording, no log profiles, nothing that would make a hybrid shooter even consider this camera. Pentax's argument was always that they were a stills-first company, and that's fine, except their stills performance wasn't revolutionary either. Yes, the camera was weather-sealed like a tank. Yes, it had in-body stabilization. Yes, it had that classic Pentax build quality that felt like you could use it as a hammer and it would survive. But none of that mattered when the core technology was 5 years behind the competition. The K-3 Mark III was a love letter to a fan base that deserved better. It was Pentax saying, "We know you'll buy this because you love us." And that felt exploitative. People still bought it because Pentax users are some of the most dedicated in the industry. But deep down, even they knew they were making a purchase based on sentiment, not sense. At number 8, Leica D-Lux 8. Leica is a brand built on prestige, heritage, and the kind of aspirational luxury that makes people feel like artists just by holding the camera. But the D-Lux 8, released in 2024, exposed something uncomfortable about Leica's business model. This wasn't a Leica camera. It was a Panasonic LX100 Mark II with a Leica badge and a price tag that made you question reality. Let's be brutally honest here. The D-Lux 8 is essentially a rebranded Panasonic camera that you could buy for significantly less money under the Panasonic name. Same sensor, same lens, same core technology. The only real differences were cosmetic and the Leica branding. For that Leica badge, you paid nearly double what you'd pay for the functionally identical Panasonic version. This wasn't about optical superiority or engineering excellence. This was about selling a logo to people who wanted the status symbol of owning a Leica without understanding what made real Leicas special. And here's where it gets worse. The D-Lux 8 wasn't even particularly good by compact camera standards. The sensor was small, the zoom range was limited, the video features were mediocre, and the performance in low light was average at best. You were paying luxury prices for mid-tier technology wrapped in a pretty body. For the price of a D-Lux 8, you could buy a far more capable mirrorless camera with interchangeable lenses that would actually grow with you as a photographer. But people still bought it. Why? Because it said Leica on the front, because it came in a red box, because owning a Leica, any Leica, made them feel like they were part of an exclusive club. The D-Lux 8 wasn't a camera for photographers. It was a status symbol for people who wanted to be seen as photographers. And Leica knew exactly what they were doing when they released it. Now, before we move to number 7, if you're finding this breakdown valuable and you want to stay updated on all things cameras, tech, and gear, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're building something special here at AltBuzz, and we don't want you to miss out. Let's keep going. At number 7, Nikon Z30. Nikon looked at the booming world of content creators and thought, we can do this. The Z30, released in 2022, was their attempt to capture the vlogging market that Sony and Canon were already dominating. On paper, it made sense. A compact, affordable, mirrorless camera with a flip-out screen, good autofocus, and compatibility with Nikon's Z-mount lenses. The problem? Nikon forgot to include a viewfinder. And that one decision turned a potentially solid camera into something that felt incomplete. Now, I know what some people are thinking. Vloggers don't need viewfinders. They're shooting themselves on the flip screen. That's true for pure vlogging setups, but here's the issue. Nikon marketed the Z30 as a hybrid camera. They wanted it to be your everyday carry, your travel camera, your video workhorse. But without a viewfinder, it was crippled for photography in bright sunlight. Try composing a shot on an LCD screen when the sun is glaring directly at it. It's nearly impossible. You're left guessing, hoping your exposure is correct, praying your focus landed where you intended. For a camera that cost what the Z30 cost, that was unacceptable. And then there's the overheating. The Z30 would overheat during extended recording sessions, which is exactly what vloggers and content creators do. Nikon implemented recording limits to prevent damage, but those limits meant you couldn't rely on this camera for long-form content without workarounds. The competition didn't have these problems. Sony's ZV-E10, priced similarly, offered better video specs, better ergonomics, and actual unlimited recording without overheating. The Z30 felt like Nikon was late to a party they didn't understand. They saw the trend, they tried to capitalize on it, but they didn't do the homework. They didn't talk to actual creators. They didn't understand the workflow. And the result was a camera that frustrated the very audience it was designed for. People still bought it because the Nikon name carries weight, but those buyers quickly realized they'd been sold a compromise disguised as a solution. At number 6, Sony A7S Mark III. Wait, hold on. Before you lose your mind, hear me out. The Sony A7S Mark III is an incredible camera. It's a low-light beast. The video quality is stunning. The autofocus is borderline magical. This camera has been used to shoot everything from indie films to high-end commercials. So why is it on this list? Because Sony priced it in a way that felt like punishment, and because by the time it finally launched, it was already being outpaced by its own siblings. The A7S Mark III was announced in 2020 with a price tag of $3,500. That's flagship territory. That's cinema camera territory. And while the specs justified some of that cost, the reality is that for most users, the A7S Mark III was overkill. The 12-megapixel sensor meant this camera was useless for serious stills work. If you were a hybrid shooter who needed both great video and great photos, you had to look elsewhere. The A7 Mark IV, which came out a year later, offered better resolution, similar video capabilities, and cost $1,000 less. Suddenly, the A7S Mark III felt like a niche tool for a very specific type of shooter, not the revolutionary release Sony hyped it up to be. And let's talk about the weighting. Sony teased this camera for years. The A7S Mark II was released in 2015 and was showing its age badly by 2018. Creators were begging for an update. Sony kept them waiting until 2020, and by then, competitors had caught up. Panasonic's S1H was already on the market with better codec options. Canon's R5, despite its overheating issues, was offering 8K. The A7S Mark III was great, but it wasn't the leap forward people expected after 5 years of waiting. People still bought it because Sony's video autofocus is unmatched, and because the low-light performance is genuinely unreal. But many of those buyers would have been better served by the A7 Mark IV or even the FX3, which offered similar video performance in a more practical package. The A7S Mark III is a worse camera, not because it's bad, but because it represents Sony's tendency to overprice and underdeliver on the hype they themselves create. Quick heads up before we continue. Did you know we have a full website at altbuzzmedia.com? We publish in-depth reviews, buying guides, and gear comparisons that go even deeper than what we cover here. Check it out when you get a chance. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. Now let's get back to it. At number 5, Panasonic Lumix GH5 Mark II. Panasonic had a golden goose with the GH5. It was the camera that defined professional hybrid shooting for years. YouTubers loved it. Filmmakers loved it. It was reliable, powerful, and reasonably priced. So when Panasonic announced the GH5 Mark II in 2021, people expected a revolution. What they got was a firmware update disguised as a new camera. The GH5 Mark II added phase detect autofocus, which was great because the GH5's contrast detect system was its biggest weakness. But that was basically it. The sensor was the same. The video specs were nearly identical. The body design was virtually unchanged. Panasonic took a 4-year-old camera, added the autofocus system everyone had been begging for, and charged full price for it like it was a brand new release. It felt lazy. It felt like Panasonic didn't respect the people who made the GH5 a success. And here's the real kick in the teeth. Just months before the GH5 Mark II launched, Panasonic had already announced the GH6. Everyone knew the GH6 was coming. Everyone knew it would be the real upgrade. So the GH5 Mark II existed in this bizarre limbo where it was too expensive to be a budget option and too outdated to compete with what was coming. It was a stopgap that nobody asked for, priced like it mattered. People still bought it because the Panasonic ecosystem is strong and because some users wanted the incremental improvements without jumping to the GH6's higher price point. But for most people, the GH5 Mark II was a waste of money. You were better off buying a used GH5 and saving your cash for the GH6, or jumping ship to Sony or Canon's newer offerings. The GH5 Mark II is a perfect example of a company coasting on past success without delivering real innovation. At number 4, Zeiss ZX1. The Zeiss ZX1 was supposed to be revolutionary. A full-frame camera with a fixed 35mm lens, built-in Adobe Lightroom, and enough internal storage to eliminate memory cards entirely. It sounded like science fiction, a camera for purists who wanted to shoot, edit, and publish all from a single device. When Zeiss announced it in 2018, photographers were intrigued. When it finally launched in 2020, they were horrified. The ZX1 cost $6,000. $6,000 for a camera with a fixed lens, no interchangeable optics, and specs that were already outdated by the time it shipped. The sensor was 37 megapixels, which sounds impressive until you realize competitors were offering similar or better resolution with far more versatility. The built-in Lightroom was clunky and slow, a gimmick that sounded better in theory than in practice. Most photographers who tried it ended up transferring files to a real computer anyway, because editing on a camera screen was frustrating and impractical. And that fixed lens. Sure, it was a Zeiss lens, and yes, it was sharp, but 35mm isn't for everyone. Portrait photographers need longer focal lengths. Wildlife and sports shooters need zoom. By locking users into a single focal length, Zeiss eliminated entire categories of photographers from their target audience. The ZX1 wasn't a tool for working photographers. It was a concept camera for wealthy hobbyists who wanted something exclusive and unusual. Almost nobody bought it. The ZX1 became a case study in how not to launch a camera. It was overpriced, underspec'd, impractical, and launched years too late. Zeiss eventually discontinued it quietly, and today it's a curiosity, a reminder that even legendary brands can misread the market so badly that they produce something almost nobody wants. Before we move on to the top 3, I want to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already. Seriously, it helps us keep creating content like this. And here's something new. YouTube now offers channel memberships where you can directly support creators you believe in. You can join the Alt Buzz community for as little as $5 a month and get access to exclusive perks and behind-the-scenes content. If you value what we're doing here, consider becoming a member. It makes a real difference. Now let's continue. At number 3, Olympus OMDEM5 Mark III. Micro Four Thirds was supposed to be the future. Smaller sensors, smaller lenses, better portability without sacrificing quality. Olympus was one of the champions of this system, and for a while they made incredible cameras that punched far above their weight. But the OMDEM5 Mark III, released in 2019, felt like Olympus was giving up. This camera was positioned as a mid-range option, sitting between Olympus's entry-level models and their flagship EM1 series. The problem? It didn't feel mid-range. It felt like a downgrade from cameras Olympus had released years earlier. The build quality was cheaper. The grip was less ergonomic. The electronic viewfinder was lower resolution than models that came before it. And worst of all, the image quality wasn't noticeably better than the older EM5 Mark II it was supposed to replace. By 2019, full-frame mirrorless cameras were becoming more affordable. Sony, Canon, and Nikon were all pushing full-frame systems hard, and the price gap between Micro Four Thirds and full-frame was shrinking fast. The EM5 Mark III cost around $1,200, which put it dangerously close to entry-level, full-frame bodies that offered better low-light performance, shallower depth of field, and more future-proof lens ecosystems. Olympus tried to argue that Micro Four Thirds was about the system, the compact lenses, the portability, and sure, those are real advantages for some users, but most photographers would rather carry a slightly larger bag and get the image quality benefits of a larger sensor. The EM5 Mark III felt like Olympus was trying to convince people that smaller was still better, even as the market was screaming the opposite. People still bought it because Olympus's in-body stabilization is legendary, and because the Micro Four Thirds lens lineup is genuinely excellent. But those buyers were making an emotional purchase, clinging to a system that was already in decline. Olympus would eventually sell their entire camera division, and the EM5 Mark III stands as one of the final nails in that coffin. At number 2, Fujifilm X-S20. Fujifilm is a brand photographers fall in love with. The colors, the film simulations, the retro design language, it all feels special. So when Fujifilm announced the X-S20 in 2023 as a more affordable, accessible version of their flagship XS series, expectations were high. What they delivered was a camera that felt like it was designed by committee, stripped of everything that made Fujifilm special in a misguided attempt to appeal to everyone. The X-S20 was supposed to be the vlogging-friendly, content creator-focused version of Fujifilm's X-series lineup. It had a flip-out screen, solid video specs, and decent autofocus. On paper, it checked boxes. In practice, it felt soulless. Fujifilm removed physical dials in favor of a mode dial, which alienated the enthusiast photographers who love Fujifilm, specifically because of those tactile controls. The grip was smaller and less comfortable. The build quality felt cheaper. It was like Fujifilm looked at Sony's playbook and said, "Let's copy that," without understanding that people came to Fujifilm specifically because they weren't Sony. And the pricing was baffling. The X-S20 cost nearly $1,400, which put it in direct competition with the X-T5, a camera that was better in almost every way. Better build, better controls, better sensor, and more respect for what Fujifilm actually stood for. The X-S20 existed in this weird middle ground where it was too expensive for beginners and too compromised for enthusiasts. Fujifilm's biggest sin with the X-S20 was betraying their identity. People choose Fujifilm because they want something different. They want beautiful colors out of camera. They want physical dials and knobs. They want cameras that feel like tools made for photographers, not algorithms. The X-S20 threw all of that away in an attempt to chase market share, and the result was a camera that satisfied no one. People still bought it because Fujifilm's brand loyalty is strong, but many of them felt disappointed, like they'd been sold a compromised version of the brand they loved. So we've covered 9 cameras that deserve to be called out. Some were overpriced, some were outdated, some betrayed their own fan bases. But number 1? This one's going to sting. At number 1, Canon EOS R1, Canon's flagship, their professional mirrorless camera designed to replace the legendary one, DX Mark III, a camera built for sports photographers, photojournalists, and professionals who demand absolute reliability. Canon spent years hyping this camera. They positioned it as the ultimate tool for working pros, and when it finally launched in 2024, it was a masterclass in disappointment. Let's start with the sensor. 24 megapixels in 2024. Canon put a 24 megapixel sensor in a camera that cost over $6,000. Their own R5, a camera that came out 4 years earlier, had 45 megapixels. Sony's A1, Canon's direct competitor, had 50 megapixels. Nikon's Z9 had 45. Canon's argument was that 24 megapixels was enough for sports and action. And sure, that's technically true. But enough isn't good enough when you're asking professionals to invest $6,000. Pros need flexibility. They need to crop. They need resolution for large prints and commercial work. 24 megapixels felt like Canon saying, "Trust us, you don't need more." And that's patronizing. Then there's the burst speed. The R1 could shoot 30 frames per second, which sounds incredible until you realize the Z9 was already doing that. The A1 was doing that, and Canon was late to a party where everyone else had already set the standard. The R1 wasn't pushing boundaries. It was catching up. And for a flagship, that's unacceptable. But the real betrayal was the price versus the value. $6,000 for the body alone. For that money, you could buy a Z9 or an A1 and get better resolution, similar speed, and features that felt current, not borrowed from competitors. Canon banked entirely on brand loyalty. They assumed sports photographers and photojournalists would buy the R1 because they'd always bought Canon's 1 series bodies, and many did. But those buyers weren't excited. They were resigned. They bought the R1 because they were already invested in Canon glass, not because the R1 was the best camera on the market. Canon had years to make this camera revolutionary. They had the resources, the technology, and the talent. Instead, they delivered a camera that felt like the bare minimum they could get away with while still calling it a flagship. The EOS R1 isn't the worst camera because it's broken or unusable. It's the worst camera because it represents everything wrong with how legacy brands treat their most loyal customers. It's complacency disguised as innovation. It's a premium price tag attached to middle-of-the-road specs. And it's a reminder that the biggest names in the industry can get away with disappointing you as long as they know you'll keep coming back. So there you have it. 10 cameras that earned their place on this list for very different reasons. Some were too expensive, some were too late, some betrayed the trust of the people who love them. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single one of these cameras still found buyers. Because brand loyalty is powerful, because sunk cost fallacy is real, because sometimes we buy cameras with our hearts instead of our heads. The market is brutal, and it doesn't forgive mistakes. Cameras that should have been celebrated became cautionary tales. Companies that should have led became followers, and photographers who trusted those brands were left wondering if they made the right choice. Every camera has strengths, every system has its place. But when you're spending your hard-earned money, you deserve better than compromise. You deserve better than complacency. And you deserve companies that respect you enough to earn your business, not just assume they already have it. If you made it this far, drop a comment with your own worst camera pick. What camera disappointed you? What release made you question a brand you loved? And if you found this breakdown valuable, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started at AltBuzz. Also, YouTube has introduced a feature called Super Thanks that lets you directly support creators with a small monetary contribution. If this video helped you make smarter buying decisions or just entertain you, consider sending a Super Thanks our way. It genuinely helps us keep creating content like this. Until next time, shoot with intention and never settle for good enough when great is out there waiting.